go. Okay. Both parents and his only aunt were registered nurses. He developed a love for the healthcare setting in his mid-teens when his mother worked in a small hospital. And several of his friends also had family members who were on staff. After leading out in churches for 10 and a half years, Merlin finally realized his dream of becoming a hospital chaplain over 22 years ago. He has established pastoral care departments at 2 hospitals and has served as a staff chaplain at a large medical center in Denver, Colorado. He enjoys people, learning, teaching, and living in Central Texas. And I'd like to thank Merlin for coming all the way out here from San Marcos to provide us with this talk.
I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I hope that my whole institution is a palliative care setting. I hope that my whole hospital is. I know that we're not always, but that's our goal, and that's what we want to continue to work toward more effectively. I appreciate the opportunity to hear the presentations that I've already heard. I've learned from them. I've known Dr. Grumbles for 22 years. We worked together in Central Texas Medical Center, and where she, as at that time, was director of the respiratory therapy department, now cardiopulmonary. And I've always enjoyed Lee and her work. I want to explore the difference between curing and healing, and we've already talked about that some, and I think that's very, very important. And how to identify spiritual factors. I really believe this is important because all of the caregivers in your setting provide spiritual care. And I want to make sure that everybody understands that, and everybody understands how to deliver effective spiritual care, because the chaplains are not the only ones who do it. If they did, there wouldn't be very much done. There's not very many of us, number-wise, and you understand that. And how to provide effective spiritual support. Now, we've already talked about this, the difference between curing and healing. The death rate among humans is still 100%. I heard a news item, Paul Harvey told about some new medical advancement just recently, and he said it has lowered the death rate for this disease by 25% or whatever it was. Well, that's false, because the death rate for that disease is still 100%. It's prolonged the dying or prolonged the life, but sometimes it's just prolonging the dying. And so it hasn't reduced the death rate. And the best thing that we can do, and this is a review, again, is sometimes delay death. And the cure rates for many diseases are still low. And if we make cure our top priority, we're going to bring a lot of frustration and disappointment. And I think that's a reason for a lot of burnout among physicians and other family members. I had an opportunity to visit with a retired physician 2-3 weeks ago. He was waiting with a friend in the surgery waiting room, and visited with him, and he was telling me that when he attended his 25th anniversary class of his medical school 25 years ago or so, he said that there hadn't been one of his classmates who had died of natural causes. There had been several died, but all of them died of suicide. Isn't that sad? And I think this kind of concept and this kind of mindset feeds into that. And we need to help everyone understand that death is not a defeat. It's inevitable. We need to learn how to deal with it, and to recognize that death is not always the greatest enemy. I want to talk just a bit about curing and healing. We can help create an environment in which healing can take place. Healing is different than curing. And sometimes we make that synonymous, but it's not. Healing has to do with the spiritual concepts, the spiritual parts of a person. It has to do with emotional things. It has to do with a other things than just stopping that disease process or eliminating that disease. And I know that you folks are familiar with people who die from an illness for which they present themselves to you, but they've received healing. Okay? And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And that's what my friend Chuck Meyer, who used to be at St. David's Hospital in Austin, would refer to as a good death. When a person has experienced healing, they're able to die in peace. They have things reconciled. They have their life wrapped up, and they feel good about it, and they're ready to die. And that's when I think a person has experienced healing. I worked with Bob Snyder in Florida. Bob was the COO of our hospital, and I always followed him in orientation, and I would generally slip in for the last few minutes of his time of orientation. And I've heard him say this so many times. We cure sometimes, we heal often, we comfort always. And I think that's what we're talking about in palliative care. Sometimes we can see cures. Unfortunately, it's not as often as we would wish. We would like to be able to see more. But we can heal often if we create the right environment and the right kind of care with all of us working together. And it takes that. We can always comfort. We can always bring comfort. Harry Chapman, who wrote the book Radical Loving Care, says the great unfinished business of health care is not curing, but healing. He's very strong on this, and I would recommend that book. I tried to find it in Albuquerque. I tried to find it in Denver. And when I got back home, I found it on the web. It's from Baptist Healing Trust, I believe, www.Baptist Healing Trust in Nashville. BaptistHealingTrust.org, I believe. I had that in the bibliography. But I would recommend that book very highly. Now, when we think of spirituality, most people think of religion. And I dare say that if you look at a spiritual assessment in your institution, you will probably see some questions about people's religious faith. What church preference do you have? That's not synonymous. That's not synonymous. Religion is a system of codified beliefs and practices, the rituals, the liturgy, related to one's belief in God or gods or in a higher power. It's a system, and it has to do with external things. It has to do with actions and so forth. It may or may not be effective in meeting the spiritual needs of the adherent, and it might be a substitute for spirituality. And we meet people occasionally who are very religious, but who have put that in place of a meaningful spirituality, and they think they're spiritual persons, but they're just religious persons. Okay? So there are things that we can do to determine how to support a person spiritually. A person who may or may not be religious. Now, it's very easy for most of us to assist a person who has the same religious beliefs than we do. We know where they are. But it's a little bit more difficult to support a person who has different religious beliefs or who doesn't seem to have any religious beliefs at all. It's more difficult for us to do that. So I'd like to discuss some ways of looking at spiritual qualities that are important to everybody, whether or not they have a spiritual orientation. Those things that we can do to support them. And by the way, going back to the idea of everybody having a part in spiritual care, I've got to relate a story. Peter is a part of our healthcare system now. He's in charge of spiritual nurture in one of our institutions. But a few years ago, he was pastor. And he had a patient who had to go into the hospital for heart bypass surgery in his 40s. Now, this is kind of scary when they're that young. And the guy was scared. You know, type A personality, typical guy that would have to have that at that age. And he was scared. And so Peter went to see him the afternoon. He found out he was there. He found out he was going to have surgery next day. So he went in and he visited with him a little bit. And then he said, would you like to have a prayer? And he said, yes, I need a prayer. And so Peter had a prayer with him. And, you know, asked that he be able to rest well that night, be prepared for his surgery. And he said, after the prayer, he said, look, I'm not going to come and see you tomorrow because I know you're going to have surgery in the morning. Tomorrow afternoon, you're not going to feel like visiting. So he said, I'm going to come and see you the next morning. And, well, that's reasonable. So the second morning, Peter came in to visit. He walked into the room, and Jim said, your prayer didn't work. He said, tell me about it. He said, well, I felt a little bit better after you visited me, but he said, boy, by 9 o'clock I was uptight and scared. And he said, all I could do was lay there in bed and count the holes in the ceiling tile. And he said, I couldn't sleep. And he said, at 1 o'clock in the morning, a housekeeper came in and she was mopping the floor and she looked over at me. And she said, you're having surgery in the morning, aren't you? And he said, how can you tell? She said, you all look the same. And she put down her mop and she said, would you like me to have a prayer with you? And he said, yes, I would. And she came over by my bed and she took my hand and she prayed for me. And he said, within a few minutes, I was sound asleep and I slept real good until they came and woke me up to get ready for the surgery. And he said, your prayer didn't work, but hers did. He said, you were praying because you got paid to. She was praying because she wanted to. Now, if you are a religious person and if you feel comfortable doing that, I would encourage you, if your institution will allow it, and not all do, be aware of those kinds of things. People are expecting the chaplain to pray with them. People are expecting their clergy to pray with them. They don't think that's in your job description. And so if you are religiously inclined and feel comfortable doing that, feel free to ask a patient if they would like to have a prayer. More often than not, they will say yes, they would like that. And it might be more meaningful to them than having the chaplain come in and have a prayer. Now let's talk about spirituality. Spirituality is concerned with personal beliefs and values and experiences that bring life to the person. Spirituality might be integrated with their religion, or it may exist without a religious experience. All the person might not be religiously turned. Non-religious people may have a very effective spirituality. People who once were religious may have been hurt by organized religion, disappointed by a clergy person, and been disenchanted with the religious setting. That does not mean that they do not have spiritual needs, that they might not accept and receive spiritual support for those needs. Please be aware of that, because we can all work together and provide the kind of spiritual care that's needed for the folks that we serve. I want to list 7 spiritual factors that are common among human beings. And the first one is a concept of God or a higher power. What is the highest authority in a person's mind or in their lives? Most of us might call that God. Some people call that something else. But everybody has something that they look to as the ultimate authority in their life. Is that God beneficent or benevolent, kind, or vengeful and harsh? What is their view of God or of a higher power? And if one claims not to believe in such, what is the ultimate influence in his life? Is it science, reason? And all of those things people have, and we need to determine that and see if that is meeting their need and how it's meeting their need, so we can work with them and support them in a way that's going to be meaningful to them. Okay? Does one have a sense of holy or transcendent? Something greater and bigger than oneself? Those things are important, and that's a key spiritual component of human beings. Number 2, how does one see this God or a higher power relating to her? Is there a purpose for her life? Or does he see providence ordering anything good for his life? Or can he trust in God or a higher power? Or is everything just happenstance and willy-nilly or fate? Is there something that's meaningful to this person? Okay. Is there a purpose for his or her life? Does a person have a faith? Now, when we talk about faith, usually we think of that in a religious context as well. But I'd like to expand that definition a little bit to include a trust in processes, in people, in community. Is there a trust in life enough to be engaged in life? To really be living or just sitting on the sidelines? We used to use the question, if life was a ball game, a baseball game, where would you be at the stadium? Would you be out there on the field? Would you be pitching? Would you be up to bat? Or would you be up in the stands someplace? Are you really involved in life? And we can find out whether a person is really engaged or involved in life, or just withdrawn from life. Is it too fearful to be a part of, you know? And these are important factors in a person's spirituality. What about grace or gratefulness? That's a sense of perhaps getting more than one deserves, or of being forgiven. Does she feel worthy of forgiveness? Or does one have to be perfect to be acceptable or to accept oneself? Can he receive a gift or a compliment? And we can think about this in our own experiences. Are you uncomfortable when someone pays you a compliment? Do you feel that you have to compliment them back? Can you receive a gift without being obligated to give another gift in return? A lot of the gift stuff we do is not gifting at all. It's just trading stuff, and you know that. But you can you receive a gift and say thank you, or do you feel an obligation to give one back? And this is a spiritual factor. And as we talk to those that we're serving, those that we're caring for, we can think about that. We can help them to think about that aspect. Are they worthwhile enough to receive without having to give again? That's grace. That's grace. And then does one accept responsibility for one's own choices? You know, we see people all the time that are suffering from illnesses that are lifestyle related, something that they've done, but they can't understand why this happened to me. You know. And if they come to realize that they are responsible for something that has happened to them, is she willing to change, to make things better? You know, and I know our physicians have to deal with this. I know our physical therapists, respiratory therapists have to deal with this. Well, you know, do you realize that your smoking is exacerbating your COPD and you need to stop smoking? Well, I've smoked for 40 years. I'm not going to stop now. You know, but that's just one area of life. There's so many areas of life that that's pertinent to. Does he just see himself a victim of life or circumstances or so forth? Just a little chip floating on the stream, you know? Or is there anything that he can do to change his direction or course? And those things are spiritual components. What about one's relationship with others? We're talking about community here. Do people have bonds? Does she have bonds with others that are supportive and rewarding? Does it matter that people care? Is he accepting of others? Does he find others accepting of him? And is there a sense of kinship with others? You know, I'm sure that you belong to groups, and maybe it's a fraternity, maybe it's your office area, maybe it's some other arena of your life, that you feel kind of like, you know, you're related to these people. It's kind of like family. Not everybody has that. And if people, sometimes people do not realize how much they are cared for by others, how much they mean to others. And sometimes it's helpful to reflect this to them. And we'll talk a little bit about how. What about a sense of vocation? I'm not talking about our particular job here necessarily, but does one have a sense of being a part of a cosmic purpose, something that may be above just what they do for a living? Do they have a purpose for life? I asked a question the other evening of a friend of mine who's in Florida. I got acquainted with her over the loss of a granddaughter, and tragic loss of a granddaughter. And I've been visiting with her on the phone, and I asked her, what makes life meaningful for you? What do you do that really makes life worthwhile? She said, that's a good question. I don't know. But you can bet she's thinking about it. And when I talk with her again, I think she's going to have an answer, because she said she was going to think about it. I think it's important that people have a sense of purpose. Lee Grumbles mentioned her patient that's 101 years old. My dad will be 101 on June 20. And my mom died a little over 4 years ago. And his twin sister had died about 6 weeks before my mom. That was a rough year. We didn't think he was going to make it through that year. Wasn't that he's, you know, his physical strength was any different. I mean, physiologically, but something happened, and he wasn't sure he was going to make it through that year either. But finally, he realized he had something to live for. And he's continued to live. And he's told me that. He said, well, I've decided I've got something to live for. And so he's continued on. And we're glad that he has. And he's not going to live forever, but he's enjoying life because it's worthwhile. Now, does the part he plays at work and relationships and life in general have value in the universal scope of things? Does it matter that he's here on this earth? Does he make a difference? And we all have to know, we all have to believe that we make a difference. Our life's not going to be worth living. We're not going to stay around very long. And many times when people come to the end and they die, it's because at that time, if they die at that time, I mean, it's because they've decided that their life has no more purpose and no more value. I remember a patient a few years ago who I met in the hospital, and she was diagnosed with ALS, and she was in her early 50s. She had known someone who had just recently died with ALS, and she was just scared of the end stage of that, and you know what I mean. she was really terrified of that. She went into the nursing home right after she died, and I have the privilege of serving that nursing home too. And so I was able to follow her a little bit, and we talked about it. She had almost no symptoms of that ALS yet. Some little symptoms so that they could make the diagnosis, but she wasn't suffering any deficits yet. And within about 2 months, she had died. And otherwise, she was in good health. Our minds are extremely powerful, and our will is extremely powerful. And she just shut it down. Okay, those are spiritual factors. Now, what about assessing? How do we assess the patient in connection with these things? How do we know where a patient is in regard to these factors and these elements in their lives? Well, we do it by requesting the patient's story, by empathic listening. And you are in different fields of labor. You're in different professions. Some of you have more time with patients than others. And some of you have to get that story over a period of time in increments. But it's amazing how much you can learn from a patient about themselves in a short period of time by asking the right questions. And if we prime the pump, people need to tell their stories. And when people are ill, they are more likely to tell their stories. There's something within us that prompts us to need to let other people know who we are and where we are. And if you can be a good listener, and if you can encourage people to talk, you can learn a lot about where a person is spiritually and how you might be able to support that person spiritually. You reflect on the story, reflect back to them things that you're hearing them say. And then we respond to the story. We respond to the story about our perceptions of that story that they have told us. Reflecting is a little different than responding. We're reflecting back to make sure that we heard them correctly. And then we're responding by our impressions of what that story did for us and how it touched us. And then we review that story with the patient in light of those particular things. And maybe even ask for clarification about those things. He was a machinist. He worked in a machine shop all of his life. To me, that would be awfully boring, but to him, it was marvelous because it was creative. He was able to do things with that machine that were marvelous. He was able to make parts that went to the moon and those kinds of things, you see. That's a purpose in life. It was meaningful to him. But he may have lost sight of that. He may have lost sight of that. When people become ill, they get into what Ari Chapman called a liminal state. It's between one thing and another, and sometimes that's unexplored territory and we don't know what to do. You remember when you were going from adolescence into full teenage years? And it was a liminal state then. You weren't sure what you were supposed to do when you got to be a teenager. And then in your late teens into adulthood, there's another transition point. Well, this is a transition point in people's lives. They've become ill now. They're used to being healthy, probably, or fairly so. But now they're ill and they're not sure what they're supposed to do or what they're supposed to be or how they're supposed to react to it. And so they're adjusting and they're reaching out. And sometimes this kind of thing clouds And the emotions of it cloud their faith, cloud what they've experienced, cloud the successes that they've experienced in life, even the bonds that they've had with other people now seem kind of tenuous, and they're afraid they're losing that contact. And especially if they've heard some news that they might have a terminal illness, or they might have a very difficult time ahead with this chronic thing that they're suffering with, they don't know how to adjust to it. And so they haven't lost their spiritual roots, but they've lost a sense of having them. And we can help reconnect them with those things by reviewing the story with the patient. And they say, I'm not sure my life has really done that much. But they've just told us that they have 5 children, they have 8 grandchildren, and they have 3 great-grandchildren that they're just so proud of, and they have done well, and they've been successful. And it's helpful to play those things back to them, to remind them that their children are not successful by accident. It's because of the modeling that they gave to those children as parents. Their grandchildren are becoming successful because of the way they taught their children how to be parents. Just remind them of these things. Get them back in touch with those things that were important and valuable to them. That's spiritual care. That's spiritual care, and it doesn't take a chaplain to do that. In fact, if we wait for the chaplain to do that, it may not be done because the chaplain may not get around to visiting that patient, or may not cue into what that patient has revealed to you, right? So we all work together to provide that kind of care. Now, a most important aspect of spiritual support is our care for the patients, caring for the patients. And this is, I'm pretty fanatical about this. I wish that we could get taken care of, clear out of our vocabulary as caregivers. I wish we could do away with that. Well, we can't. It's ingrained in us to a certain extent. But as we talked about earlier, our semantics makes a lot of difference. And I would like for us to get used to, say, caring for our patients instead of taking care of our patients. Okay? Taking care of is kind of sterile. Taking care of means that we're providing for their physical needs. We may be giving our shots very effectively and efficiently. We may have our infection control rates down. We may be doing all these technical things perfectly. But a baby who is just fed and changed is going to die if they're not loved. It's not a whole lot different with an older person. And it doesn't matter whether that older person is in their 50s, their 60s, or if they're 100. They need to be cared for. They need to be cared for. If we just take care of them, we're not doing everything that we need to be doing as human beings. Because as spiritual creatures, we care for one another. That's a most important spiritual aspect. What does it mean to support this patient spiritually? One is validation and value. And I mentioned reviewing that story with the patient, reminding them of the value their life has been. It's validating that person and that life that they've lived, the things that they've been able to do. Now, they may have had some bitter disappointments in life. They may not have been able to become what they wanted to become. And when we become old, when we become ill, we begin to review those things, don't we? When we become my age, we begin to review those things. I'm 61, and you start looking back and say, man, did I accomplish what I wanted to accomplish? I don't have very many years of work left or relationships left. Yeah, maybe I'll live as long as my dad. But I want my life to be worthwhile. So, did it have value? And if this person is really disappointed with how their life has turned out, it may be necessary to help probe with them a little bit. Some things that were valuable in their life. Place value on that. And then affirm that person. Call his or her attention to successes that you've learned from the story. And that's important. Everybody has had successes. Everybody has. And if we listen enough, we can find some that we can play back to them and help them understand the value of their life, the success that they've had, to affirm their reason for being in this world. And then I want to mention touch. I think this is really, really important. Ashley Montague talked about how humans are skin-starved. You know, the lower animals caress each other and lick each other and all kinds of stuff, a lot. And human beings, especially those of us whose heritage is Northern Europe, we tend to be, kind of distant. We're not very tactile with one another. And some of the other cultures as well, we're not very tactile. Now, Dr. Danuzzo has an advantage in that. He's from Southern Europe, his heritage, and they're very tactile and they hug each other and they touch each other. But when a person is old, infirmed, if they're not very physically attracted, they're not touched very much. Does that diminish their need for touch? Not at all, folks. It's really important that they get some touching. And a lot of folks in that condition, they're only touched when they're bathed, their blood pressure vitals are taken, they're cleaned. We can't let that happen. We've got to touch them in a way that shows that we care. And believe me, it's really neat to watch people respond to this. I mentioned that I have the privilege of working at a nursing home some. And a lot of those folks are just really neglected. They really are. But when you put your arm around their shoulder, when you hold their hand, when you can touch them in a meaningful way, they light up. That's a spiritual thing. And we need to do that. That's a part of our supporting our people spiritually. And we need to do that. Okay, thank you. Now, genuine caring and willingness to listen will go far in providing this spiritual support. One doesn't have to be religiously trained or even to have a strong religious orientation to be successful in this kind of spiritual ministry. We have people that come into our hospital that not necessarily religiously trained, and they come in, and we're a faith-based organization. And people say, well, I don't know whether this will fit for me or not. And I told them they don't have to be religiously inclined. They do need to be caring. They need to respect other people's religious beliefs, and we all need to do that. But we can do that. Neither does one have to have the same faith tradition as these spiritual values transcend religion. A person might be, I'm a Christian, a person might be Jewish. That doesn't mean I can't minister to that person. A person may be Muslim. That doesn't mean I can't minister to that person. Because we all have the same needs. We all have, and the more we get to know each other, the more we realize that we have in common. We're human beings. And we can find much in common with our patients and their families, even though their faith tradition may be much different than ours. How can we know when healing has taken place? I think we can get a good idea by the person's acceptance of their impending death or of their chronic illness, their acceptance. This is where I am, and so I'm going to be content with it. I'm going to live with it. I may not like it, but I'm going to live with it. Acceptance of themselves. And mending of relationships. Now, this might not always be accomplished. We would hope it would be, but it might not always be accomplished because relationships have two sides. But there's a peace. A peace. And of all the things that we want for those that we serve, it's peace. Peace of mind. And I think that's what we're striving for. And I believe that's the last slide. It is.
Very good. We have a few minutes for some discussion and questions for Merlin. Very good.
Any questions?
How do you approach somebody who's really adamant about not going there with prayer or the types of things that probably could be helpful in some way, but there must, how do you get around the types of things, or do you just kind of let them be where they need to be?
Yeah, I think if we can help a person to understand that we're willing to be with them wherever they are, we don't need to take them someplace, but if we're willing to just be with them where they are, I think that will help, and it'll help to reduce their resistance to allowing us to be there with them. One of my best friends is an agnostic. Another gentleman that I've had some very good discussions with claims to be an atheist. And we just have had some marvelous discussions because I respect them. They've got reasons. I've got a reason for my faith. They've got a reason for their beliefs. And we're just in different places. But that doesn't mean I'm better than them. It means that we're in different places, but we can discuss it without judging each other, and we can share together. And I respect their integrity, and their honesty, and that's something that I have really valued in those relationships. And I think if we let people know we respect that, then we'll have a point that we can visit, we can talk, and some of these other things we might be able to help them understand and deal with. Good question.
I've heard before also that we become possibly more spiritual as we get older. If it's getting closer to a point where we need more, whether it's in health or whether it's in relationships or just in things around us, and so we go towards that.
I think we become more willing to reflect. More willing to reflect and to think about these spiritual values. Maybe they're pressed on us, but I think that's true. And a lot of people in our part of the country, especially, reflect that in religious ways, but it doesn't have to be that way. But I think that's true. We become more willing to look at our lives from that aspect.
You said you work in the nursing home, and were you ministering to, say, some early dementia, or how did you do that?
Yes, and that is a difficult one.
Because they still have they can still tell you
Right.
their values.
Right. Yes. And we just go as far as they're able to be with us and to understand. And when we get into a little bit more advanced dementia, they're going to tell us things that we know is not true. I mean, it wasn't really them. But that's all right. We just go with it.
Validation.
Yeah.
Any other questions here? What about over at Lamar? Lamar's busy doing the paperwork, which is good. And SFA? Any comments or questions there? All right, well, I think we're done. Thank you very much.